So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, TJ Conway from the Rocky Mountain Institute. TJ, welcome and take it away.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you all for joining. And thank you to AAAS Epicenter. It is an honor to have the opportunity to kick off this entire symposium. I am TJ Conway. I am pleased to represent RMI, where I am a principal and I co-lead the oil and gas team. For those who don't know us, RMI is a think, do, and scale tank. We seek to transform the global energy system through market-driven solutions to align with a 1.5-degree future and secure a clean, prosperous, zero-carbon future for all. So my presentation today will help to provide critical information, concepts, and context that will hopefully set the stage for the sessions to come. To kick off, I'd like to just give you a bit more background on our work so that you understand where I'm coming from in the presentation. So if we can move to the next slide. This is an overview of our Oil and Gas Solutions Initiative team that I co-lead. We seek to advance two key pillars of our work. The first is emissions visibility. That is, the effort to better measure, model, track, and verify oil and gas emissions across the value chain. And with this more robust, actionable data, we aim to accelerate decarbonization with a range of stakeholders. So that includes in advancing market design and market activation for climate differentiation, climate-aligned business models, supporting investor portfolio allocations that are climate-aligned, and also strengthening government policy and regulation. The nexus of voluntary carbon markets and the oil and gas sector work is actually a very important focus for us. It lines up with the category of emissions differentiated market activation that you can see in the top right. So if we can move to the next slide, I will provide you with some more concrete examples of our work and how it maps to the voluntary carbon market discussions that we will have today. So our team is leading a leading modeler of oil and gas lifecycle emissions. We work closely with academics, policymakers, and companies to increase emissions transparency and quantification at the asset level. And at the core of this work is the Oil Climate Index plus gas, the results of which you can see on the left-hand side. OCI plus, as it's called, currently models the emissions intensity of over 2/3 of the world's oil and gas fields. It integrates three key open source models: OPG from Stanford, Prelim from the University of Calgary, and OPEM, which we created in-house at RMI. This work has really been pioneered by my colleague and co-lead of the team, Debbie Gordon. I would encourage you to also check out her book, No Standard Oil, which gives sort of both her personal story and background, but also how all of this work has come together. We are also a leader in advancing methane emissions detection and measurement technologies and sort of associated policies and priorities. And this is a critical input into oil and gas lifecycle modeling. As we get more and better measured data to quantify methane emissions, this is incorporated and input into our modeling. So why is all of this salient for today's presentation? Well, transparency in oil and gas emissions and reliable open source methodologies for determining life cycle emissions are essential to considering the options that we might have in voluntary carbon markets, whether it be seeking to eliminate oil supply or eliminating emissions from orphan wells, for example, through voluntary credit mechanisms. So we'll talk about that in more detail as we go on. In the next slide, we also work in very close collaboration with our carbon markets team or carbon markets initiative. And this is actually also part of the same program as the oil and gas team, or the climate intelligence program. Both of our initiatives have shared priorities around improving market transparency with the support of enabling technologies like digital technologies or remote sensing. And the Carbon Markets Initiative is especially focused on improving transparency and quality of the carbon credit supply overall. To that end, RMI has recently launched, in partnership with Ripple, Centigrade, which is a new platform to dramatically grow the supply of quality, trustworthy carbon credits in partnership with Ripple, as I mentioned. On the next slide, we get to some of the sort of the 101. Oh, sorry, the slide before that. Yes, there we go. Some of the 101 on carbon markets. So just sort of to put the carbon offsets in context, demand for carbon offsets is surging. The offset market, has grown from less than about $500 million in 2020 to over $1 billion this year. And carbon credits are used in both compliance markets and voluntary markets. So in compliance markets, this includes, for example, the EU's ETS or emissions trading scheme, or California's cap and trade system, which has been used in other states as well. Carbon credits are also so in the case of compliance markets, the majority of carbon credits are allowances. They're based on assigned quotas from governments, and there's a small amount of offsets that are involved. Whereas in voluntary markets, carbon credits are generated and traded based on industry-created standards by standard-setting bodies that I'm sure we'll discuss over the course of today. Credits are generated from generally two different types of activities, although there can be some blurred lines between the two. But the first type of activity is avoidance, or reducing or avoiding activities that generate emissions. And the second is by actually capturing or removing carbon from the atmosphere or specific sources. So that's removal. To date, a range of activities have generated some form of credit, right? From renewable energy projects to waste management and nature-based solutions. And there's an array of different nature-based solutions that you can see here. And to tie this directly to oil and gas, there is growing attention on credit generating opportunities, especially focused on avoidance, right? For example, the concept of credit generation through early field decommissioning before the end of a field's economic life has been gaining attention over the past year, and that's one example. The next slide gets to sort of this question of how we are to prioritize credit offsets vis-a-vis other decarbonization levers that are available, right? Carbon credits have an important role to play in directing finance to projects that reduce or remove carbon. But these markets are not, at this current stage, delivering the scale or impact needed to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees. And in addition, offset markets in their current form do risk doing harm, not good, specifically, for example, by delaying direct decarbonization opportunities or discouraging investment in sort of the next generation of removal offsets, both of which are essential to avoiding some of the worst impacts of climate change. So the responsible use of carbon credits should complement rather than be a substitute for direct abatement. And that's a very important element that gets to this concept of mitigation hierarchy. And this has been an area where leading initiatives like SBTI, or the Science Based Targets Initiative, have provided corporate guidance on prioritizing direct abatement and reserving carbon credits to account for unabatable emissions only, which we can talk about further. I'm sure we will today. The next slide just gets to some of the most important concepts that I'm sure will come up, in every session that we talk about today, and so it's good to just kind of level set on what each of these mean and kind of what's the underlying importance of them, really in helping to evaluate the quality of carbon credits. Right. So the first term is permanence. It's the idea that a high quality credit would ensure that associated emissions reductions are long lasting and that the risks of impermanence are mitigated. And so let's take, for example, a reforestation or afforestation project. If there is a risk that that the area that is being reforested could experience wildfire risks in the future, this is a key consideration for permanence, right? The second area is additionality, which is to say that the resulting emissions reductions or avoided emissions would not have happened without the crediting system being in place. So for example, if a renewable power project was going to be developed anyway because it was economic, or because there were policy incentives already in place that supported that project, then that would not be considered additional. And there are different types of additionality: financial, legal, regulatory, which we'll touch on a little bit further in the presentation. The third is baseline setting. And this is closely tied to some of the others, but deserves to be called out separately, as the emphasis here is on modeling a scenario over time to determine the extent of the crediting that could be generated from a particular project, right? So additionality, for example, might evolve over time. If we have the economics of a solar project improving over time, what was additional 10 years in the past might not be additional 10 years into the future. There's the leakage is another important issue, especially in the case of oil and gas, and I'll get into that further toward the end of the presentation. But at a high level, the focus here is on the notion that emissions reductions at the project being credited could result in unintended increases in emissions elsewhere. And this can be confusing in the context of oil and gas because we also have methane leakage, which is a very big factor. I'll do my best to make that distinction, but clear as we move forward. But leakage has its own specific meanings, especially related to market and activity leakage in this context. And then finally, regarding both uncertainty and co-benefits, the main point is that these things should be factored into the methodologies and the credit generation process. Okay, so on the next slide, I just want to elaborate on some of the common data challenges that we see. So, a claim on a ton of CO2 is backed by objective and subjective data, but the quality of much of this remains an issue, and there are some issues related to objective data, but I'd like to place the focus here on the subjective side of this. First, the overarching point is that there is a lot of subjectivity that is still involved, and that is in and of itself is an issue. But there are specific issues too that kind of collectively get to this overarching point. The first is around modeling uncertainty, particularly in developing baseline counterfactuals. So I've already kind of alluded to this, but the big risk here is that if modeling and baselining is not carried out well or not reliably, then this could lead to significant overestimation of the crediting process. So this is a potential risk. Second, there's just the subjectivity involved in interpreting the data that are being considered, and this can be an issue in sort of a due diligence process or at other stages of the process. And the risk here is that it just adds more confusion at a time when there's need for more clarity. Third is that critical information such as pricing information can often be not publicly available or behind paywalls, and that just complicates the effective and efficient price discovery process. And finally, there's a lack of definitive metrics in certain areas. So if we're thinking about what co-benefits might be associated, or the incorporation of socio-environmental safeguards, these are types of metrics that where there's not necessarily standardization and there's need for greater advancement there. Okay, so in the last slide, I've tried to set the stage so that I can kind of walk through some examples that are focused more directly on oil and gas using some of the vocabulary and concepts that I've introduced here. So I'm going to focus on sort of this emerging area of avoidance credits tied to permanently shutting in oil and gas production or leaking wells. And the core concept here is that all things being equal, if currently producing oil and gas fields or emitting wells instead are permanently shut in today, this could yield a potentially significant climate benefit, and there is value in that. The central questions, therefore, are, well, what type of a mechanism would need to be introduced that would incentivize, supplier emissions reductions and mitigate the unintended or potential negative consequences? And then ultimately, what value would be ascribed to this entire project or process? And the answer really gets down to some of the considerations that I tried to present earlier on conceptually. So first, let's take additionality. The critical question here being, would or should a field that is identified as a credit generating opportunity not have been permanently shut down otherwise? And so take an example of a producing field today that has a break-even oil price of $10 a barrel and a remaining producing life of 20 years. And in that case, the answer is probably pretty definitively yes, that this would be, shutting this in today would be additional. But that is kind of an extreme example, and the reality is often that there's a lot more nuance and a lot more gray. So for example, a marginal field might be economic today, but maybe it's not going to be economic in 3 years, depending on the evolution of prices, and maybe it qualifies for some type of government funding to mitigate methane leaks. So in this instance, determining additionality is much more tricky. So there's, I'm going to give another example of an orphan well that is leaking, but also should have been shut in if regulations were enforced in the past. So the question is, would this in any way, in any instance, be considered additional, or is it something that regulators and companies really should have been on the hook for to address in the past and still should be? Therefore, it's kind of outside of this market. So it's the point here is that we have to kind of consider this range of different challenging cases to better land on the methodologies and the proper approaches to thinking about these, whether or not these should be incorporated into voluntary mechanisms. That gets to also this need for robust baselining and quantification of the net climate impact and credit value. So methodologies would need to be standardized and widely accepted, and more likely than not, we would have to lean toward some of the most conservative assumptions, knowing that there is this potential risk of over generation of credits, and this includes making technical and economic assumptions about the remaining life of a field and the attendant emissions that I mentioned before. This all can be quite complicated, and then when you factor in the other uncertainties like super potent, highly variable methane leaks, it just speaks to the range of issues that could influence the entire methodological process. So finally, let's just assume that these two bars would be cleared, and that we now we're left with sort of the question of leakage, activity shifting or market shifting leakage. I think the issue here is that leakage will likely be a factor. It is just a question of how big of a factor it would be. And so let's consider a company that shuts in a field and generates a credit. So to avoid activity or portfolio leakage, the proceeds would not be invested back into oil and gas production, right? That's kind of the critical essence of this. And I think arguably those proceeds would not be invested to indirectly support oil and gas production or the oil and gas value chain in general. So that might include CCS or investments in other segments of the value chain. So kind of get the questions around where to the extent to which proceeds can be ring fenced is going to be critical. And even if we could sufficiently ring fence these proceeds, then there is this additional challenge of market leakage. And in economic terms, this is about price elasticity of supply. So if one barrel of oil is shut in, it will result in a marginal increase in price that would then incentivize at least a part of another barrel coming on stream. And so the extent of the leakage would be that fraction of the barrel that would be added back on, and taking into consideration the differential in emissions intensity between those two barrels, right? So it gets quite complicated. But the reality is, I think some of the work that we've done, I've done in partnership with Resources for the Future, for example, shows that this is a significant issue, and trying to quantify it is it is a worthwhile endeavor, but it also is complicated. So, just to conclude, while the impact of shutting down producing fields or orphan emitting wells could be significant, there is a lot of complexity that needs to be dealt with. And to bring it full circle, this underscores the importance of transparency and the need for high quality, independent, reliable data and methodologies to inform decision making. And symposiums like this are really essential to help us improve our collective understanding and find the solutions needed. So thanks again for giving me the opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to the subsequent panels.
Great. Thank you, TJ. This was very informative and really appreciate it. I will encourage everyone to go ahead and put questions in the Q&A. We already have one in there, and I'm not sure, TJ, if you had a chance to see it.
I cannot see it.
There's a question about,
I see it.
Yeah, preference on voluntary carbon markets. And if you have any thoughts on how preferences might come out.
Different standard setting bodies. I wouldn't say that there is a preference. I do think that there is one of the important questions to consider today is the degree to which standard setting bodies have sought to kind of grapple with the oil and gas crediting process through, let's say, eliminating oil supply or shutting in orphan wells, for example. The extent to which they have and are willing to develop these methodologies, given the range of other efforts underway around those bodies. So I wouldn't say that there is a preference, but I think that there is a question of the role that they have played and can play, in the future.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that insight and leaving a minute so we could get to a question. Really appreciate it.